You got to let hate go. A lot of people wonder about revenge. If I do this, how am I going to be sure that this person gets what comes to him? Well, here's the deal. As a Christ follower, that's not your concern. That person getting what they deserve, that's in the hands of an almighty God. Let me read you what it says in Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 21. It says, don't repay anyone evil for evil. This is our normal mechanism. We want to do back to them what they've done to us. Don't do that. It says, be careful to do it's what's right in the eyes of everybody. It says, don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written that it is mine to revenge. I will repay, says the Lord. God's going to take care of that. If you're worrying about if I keep loving this person, how are they going to learn their lesson? God's got that. He's not, just in control of your life. He's in control of all life. And he can manage that situation without you exacting some kind of revenge. It goes on, it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. Sound familiar? If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. I'll get to that a little bit later. But in doing this and showing them love, you're already getting revenge. It'll make their brains go, because they're not expecting that from you. He says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Love lets hate go. Love, secondly, seeks to give without getting back. Write that down. Love seeks to give without getting back. Jesus says to his followers that day, give to everyone who asks of you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. He says, do to others as you would have them do to you. Again, he just hammers home, constantly give, constantly give, constantly give. And give without seeking to give anything or get anything back. Most of us are willing to loan. And love for us, comes in sometimes interest-bearing loans. You know what I mean? Like, I'll love you if you love me plus, 4 points or whatever. I got to get a little bit extra kick from you this month. But I'll do this for you if you'll do this for me. We're a scratch my back, I'll scratch your society when it comes to love. And Jesus says, no, we're just a love people. We just love people no matter what they give back to us. Can you get your brain around that? Can you get your heart around that? That no matter what you receive back in relationships, you love anyway. Write that down. Agape love is love anyway love. You love them anyway, no matter what you receive. Now, this was totally foreign to the people of that time. They had been taught as the people of Israel not to love people on the outside. They hated Samaritans. They hated everybody who was not a chosen one. And Jesus is just pushing against the walls, and he's saying, hey, you love everybody. And you love everybody no matter what they can give back to you. He says there, that golden rule part, he says, do to others as you would have them do to you. He says, listen, if you are outside of God's grace and outside of God's love, and you are kind of functioning in that world, how would you want to be treated? Well, however you would want to be treated, the forgiveness that you would want to receive, the love that you would hope for, that's the kind of love that you could give those who are in your life, who are your enemies, who are living outside of the grace of God, who are living against what he teaches. You give them that love, the same kind of love that you would hope. He goes on and he says this, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners who love those who love them, or even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? You see how many three different times he uses the word credit there? You see that? He's asking these folks, hey, if you love like the world loves, what good is that to you? How is that going to improve your standings in life? How is that going to shape and alter your life in your following of God? You're just like the pagans. If you love in these ways, expecting these things in return, you're just like everybody else on this earth. He says, don't settle for that. The point I want to make there is that love refuses to settle for good enough. And this is something we've got to wrap our minds around if we're going to love our enemies. Because again, like I said earlier, we have our plateaus or our thresholds when it comes to love. And when it comes to love, we usually love good enough. Like we'll do the very least so that we can just get out of there and not have to love them anymore. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's like the guy at the street light, is asking for food. You happen to have an apple in your lunch for that day, and so you don't give him the whole lunch, but you chuck him the apple, and you make sure not to touch his hand or look him in the eye, because somehow you think he'll know your address if you look him in the eye. And so you do the very least, but then you can at least check off, hey, I loved an unlovely person today. Or you're going to go home armed with this message, and you're going to go to your work tomorrow, and your boss is going to be there, and you're going to try to conjure up, because his name is at the top of your list, you're going to try to conjure up the ways that you can love him the least. I'll give him one of my donuts. There, I love you. Goodbye. And this is what we do with the information that God gives us a lot of times. Let's just do the very least of this. Let's not let this transform our lives or mess us up on the inside too much. Let's just kick some in there, and at least we can say we did it. And Jesus just got done saying there, he says, listen, good enough isn't good enough. Loving fully, freely, without expecting anything in return, that's what I expect. Have you ever done a project, fellas, at your house where you had a good enough experience and it wasn't good enough? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? That leak under your sink was leaking and you had a piece of bubble gum in your mouth, and you're like, that'll do. And you come back, later that night and your whole kitchen's flooded. Yeah, good enough isn't good enough. Done right is done right. I used to have a mechanic friend back in Illinois. He used to work on big transport trucks and all that stuff. And I'd go and just hang out with him while I was working. And I remember him taking a wrench, and every bolt that he would tighten on that engine, he would tighten it 4 times beyond what tight was. And I'd be like, Denny, what are you doing? How do you ever get those, bolts back off? And, Denny was just a real simple guy. He's like, I don't want them to come back off. If those things come off while this guy's driving his rig, well, he's in a world of hurt. I'll figure that out when it's time to fix it again. But as for now, I'm tightening this up good. And that's how our love is meant to be. All the way. Without any reserve left behind. Every time, to the max, expecting nothing in return. Well, you could just anticipate these people hearing all these things and wondering, if I do this, it's going to be exhausting, Jesus. You're asking a lot. You want me to love my enemies? This is crazy love. And he's like, yep. And you can almost just anticipate them saying, what possibly good can come of this? And then he answers their question. Let's read it together. He says, love your enemies, do good to them. He's summarizing here. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. It's a summary of everything he's just said. And then he says, here's what your reward will be. Your reward will be great. And you will be what? Sons of the Most High. Here we go. 2 things that happens when we learn to love our enemies. The first thing is that our reward personally will be great. Now I want to kind of split that in 2 ways. First of all, personally, you and I, when we learn to love our enemies, here's this amazing spiritual thing that happens. When you love just good enough and you expect things in return, you have left over in our love relationships all of these unfulfilled expectations. Has anybody ever felt that in a relationship? Like you've loved your husband's ladies, and you've expected back from him this affection and this attention and all these things, and you've been left wanting. And that wanting is now making you bitter, and that bitterness is quickly taking you down a road to hate. Do you understand how that does? When you love with expectations of receiving back, those are the paths that you take. But here's the deal. If you learn to love without expecting anything in return, that burden, that weight of expectation is now lifted from you. If you can learn to love your enemies have no power over you. I got to watch, my son play in his 8th grade championship game, and we had a really good team this year. They were a decent squad of little ball players, and they were playing in this game, and these other kids were as good as them. And they were starting to kind of run into, situations where there'd be a hard foul here, or a kid would say something to somebody, under the basket and stuff like that. And they stopped playing the game, and they started focusing on their opponents. And this incredible thing happens when you're no longer focusing with all of your energies in basketball and playing basketball, and you're more worried about showing up the kid who just said this one thing to you, or hitting the kid back who pushed you in that rebound. You cease to be effective in playing the game. You see what happens? if hate creeps in, if anger and bitterness, and if you have these expectations and hopes, if all of these things are in there, you can't function properly. But listen, if you learn to love your enemies, if you learn to love without expectation, all of those things are lifted. And the Bible speaks of this peace. Remember Paul used to pray that over his churches? May the peace that surpasses understanding be yours. Do you know when this peace comes? This peace comes when we agape so well that there's nothing to encumber us anymore. There's nothing to weigh down on us anymore. Here's the blessing that comes, church. When we love like Jesus says to love here, peace is ours. That's our reward. We're free.